Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you to the Tahrir Dialogue Series number 69, The Dynamics of the Indo-Pacific Region, the Challenges and Opportunities for Japan. And I would like to ask Dean Fahmy to come to the podium to give us our introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. Before I start, can I ask everybody to either turn off their cell phones or put them on silent so that the speakers don't lose their concentration when they start talking? Thank you, Layla, for this kind introduction. Vice Minister Mori, thank you very much for being with us today. Ambassador Tagawa, thank you. Professor Mori, thank you for accepting our invitation to come and speak to us. Dr. Hussein Amin, our moderator this evening, and Dr. Muhammad Kamal, who will be our discussant, all of whom have ongoing associations with the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Dr. Amin, of course, is a full-time permanent member, and Dr. Kamal is an active participant in many of our discussions. I am truly honored today and personally very proud to be able to host this event. Over the last few years, AUC has regularly reached out to Asia because of its belief in the global content of education. It describes itself as Egypt's global university. Of course, as the founding dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, but also as a former ambassador in Japan, I have a personal interest in this area, and of course in listening to both the Vice Minister and the dear Professor today on what's happening in the region. I truly believe that the only way to completely understand each other is first to listen to each other, and if possible also to actually visit and literally see and feel what's happening in different communities, to put what we read or what is reported in a context. Now, some may think that this is just flattery or diplomatic talk. No, I'm telling you this from experience. When I went to Japan as ambassador, I had read a lot about Japan, and I was very honored to be appointed as my country's ambassador there. But to understand the context of Japanese decision-making, the context of Japanese society, and from Japan, the context of what's happening in the Asian area was extremely important as I tried to guide my own country in how best to take advantage of opportunities that existed in the region, or how best to deal with possible challenges to these opportunities. Presently, regrettably, not only do we have problems in the Middle East, in the neighboring areas to Egypt, be they that from Libya to the lack of an Arab-Israeli peace process, to the situation in Syria, Yemen, and I can go on in more detail, but we also have a particularly sensitive situation now with North Korea and what exactly is happening in that dimension. And it can, with wise statesmanship and leadership, be resolved through difficult but constructive negotiations. But it also has the potential of, with the slightest mistake, having very dangerous consequences that will affect not only theoretical security paradigms, but actually lives and material interest throughout the region. My training previously has been as a diplomat, and now my profession is an academician. And if you put those two together, the first result you get are very long speeches, whether it is to try to argue your case or previously to defend a particular position. Therefore, I will control myself, which is not the normal circumstance, but since I am the host, I have to be the most disciplined. Let me once again simply thank you all for being here. I know as we speak, the room will increasingly become even more full. It's simply a function of Cairo traffic and a very casual approach to time in this part of the Middle East. We will try to tell our guests coming in to be quiet and to keep their phones off, to allow, after the Vice Minister speaks, the professor to make his presentation. Dr. Amin will moderate the discussion, and Dr. Kamel will be the one raising questions about what the professor says or what he decides not to say, but we will force him to say in spite of that. Thank you all very much for being here. I want to thank the Japanese Embassy for their support for this event. It's a collaboration that is not new. It's ongoing, and I think it is really mutually beneficial. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Zinfahmi, for your introductory note. And now I would like to invite His Excellency, Mr. Manabu Hori, Parliamentary Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan, to give us the keynote speech. Thank you.
Thank you for your kind introduction. Former Foreign Minister Nabil Fahmy, Dr. Muhammad Kamal, Dr. Hussein Amin. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking part in this symposium today. For this symposium, we invited Hosei University Professor Satoru Mori, an expert on Japan's national security and the Japan-US alliance. Since the political turmoil in 2011, Egypt has been moving steadily towards stability even in the face of a variety of challenges. Japan supports Egypt's efforts towards stability with our conviction that there can be no stability in the Middle East and North Africa without the stability of Egypt as a regional power. In the area of education, which is key to national prosperity, our cooperation is moving forward of the introduction of Japanese-style schooling for primary education and on the Egypt-Japan University of Science and Technology, EJUST, under the Egypt-Japan Education Partnership, EJEP, which was agreed upon between the leaders of Japan and Egypt in 2016. In the area of culture, Japan is collaborating with Egypt of the project for the construction of the Grand Egyptian Museum. It is an honor for us to contribute to the preservation and attractive exhibition of artifacts from the Egyptian civilization at the World Heritage of all humankind. Japan also appreciates Egypt's economic reform and have actively supported. Last October, the direct flight between Japan and Egypt were resumed. In December, the Egypt Investment Seminar was held in Tokyo, and the Egyptian Minister of Investment and I attended the event. These positive developments encouraged the Japanese business community to have a greater interest in Egypt. Today, I would like to ask Professor Mori to give a lecture to deepen your understanding of the national security of Japan, Egypt's friends and partner. East Asia, where Japan is located, has huge potential, but the situation there is complex and in the Middle East. I wish to conclude my remarks by once again expressing my gratitude for your attendance here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Our speaker today is Professor Satoru Mori. He is the Professor of International Politics and U.S. Foreign Policy at the Department of Global Politics, Faculty of Law, Housei University. He is currently involved in several policy research projects organized by the Japan Institute of International Affairs, the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, among others, and co-chairs a joint Japan-U.S. policy recommendation project. Dr. Mori is currently undertaking research on U.S. strategy in Asia with particular focus on U.S.-China relations and Japan-U.S. relations and the U.S. defense innovation and its implications for U.S. allies. He is also preparing to initiate academic research projects on the impact of artificial intelligence on international security and the history of domestic politics of U.S. foreign policy during periods of strategic adjustment. Dr. Mori is a former Japanese Foreign Ministry official and holds a PhD degree from the University of Tokyo, LLM degrees from Columbia University Law School and Kyoto University, and an LLB degree from Kyoto University. We are honored to have you with us today, Dr. Mori, and please, I would like to invite you to start your speech. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. First of all, I would like to thank the American University in Cairo for hosting this event. And I would particularly want to extend my special thanks to former Foreign Minister, His Excellency, Dr. Nabil Fahmy, as well as Dr. Mohammed Kamal and Dr. Hussein Amin for arranging this event. And I also want to extend my gratitude to the Embassy of Japan. Particularly, it is an honor to have Your Excellency, Mr. Hori, and Ambassador Kagawa for their support for this lecture program today. And I also want to thank everyone for sharing their time today to come over to this event. It is a real privilege and honor for me to speak at this very renowned institution. Okay, so what I would like to do today is to speak to you on this emerging topic, the dynamics of the Indo-Pacific region, the challenges and opportunities for Japan. And before I get into the body of my presentation, I want to give you the main thrust or the main points of my presentation today. During the first half of my presentation, I would like to convey 2 points. My first point is that the Indo-Pacific region foresees a vast opportunity for economic growth and development, as major economies like the United States, China, and Japan are all poised to engage the region economically. This is my first point. My second point is that in order to keep the region on a positive trajectory of economic development and growth, it is necessary to do 2 things. Number one is to forge interstate relations built upon what we call a rules-based order, where interstate relations are governed by the rule of law, not by the unregulated arbitrary exercise of power. And secondly, to minimize security risks in East Asia that have implications beyond the region. And I think toward this end, the Japanese government is now pursuing this new strategy, which was alluded by Dr. Fahmy earlier, called the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy. This is an emerging concept that Japan is advancing together with other countries like the United States, Australia, and India. And I would like to explain a little bit about the details of what is included in this strategy. So that would be the first part of my presentation, talking about the positive aspect of the Indo-Pacific region. Now, toward the latter half of my presentation, I am going to make the argument that there are certain security risks that could potentially undermine this positive trajectory of the Indo-Pacific region. Now, there are different parts of the Indo-Pacific region that actually poses security risks to the economic development of the region. And there are issues in South Asia, Middle East, and also the Eastern African region. But today, I would like to share some of my insights regarding the East Asian region, because I specialize in East Asian security affairs. And I would like to touch upon three countries, three security challenges regarding the United States, China, and North Korea. With regard to the United States, I would essentially argue that one of the major strategic tasks or challenges of the Japanese government is to encourage the Trump administration to pursue a region-wide engagement through the free and open Indo-Pacific framework. This is one of the challenges. The current Trump administration is rather focused on North Korean trade, but I think we would like to see the United States expand their strategic horizon and engage other issue areas like maritime security and others. Secondly, a second security challenge is basically to induce China to abide by international rules and norms upon exercising its power. As you know, China is able to bring about economic opportunities to different parts of the world. But at the same time, they do pose certain security risks in the Western Pacific region, particularly when it comes to issues like South China Sea. So I will talk about that, those kind of security challenges with regard to China. And thirdly, of course, is to compel North Korea to completely and irreversibly dismantle its nuclear weapons programs and comply with United Nations Security Council resolution. There's a fast, rapid unfolding of various kinds of events, so I would like to touch upon some of the new developments that is now going on as we speak. So basically, this is the structure of my presentation today, and I would like to also make clear that although this program has received the support of the Japanese embassy, the remarks that I make is purely my own personal views, and I do not represent the views of the Japanese government. So I would like to make this clear at the very beginning. Okay, so allow me to speak about the opportunities of the Indo-Pacific region. As you can see from this map, what I did was I put on figures from the IMF World Economic Outlook database. These figures basically indicate that the so-called Indo-Pacific region is expected to achieve strong economic growth in the coming years. For example, when you look at East Asia, last year in 2017, it achieved 5.4% growth, whereas it is projected to achieve 4.7% growth in 2022, which is 5 years from now. Now, 4.7% is a drop from 5.4%, but it is still a significant growth when you look at a particular region. South Asia is also expected to achieve very high or very strong economic growth. In 2022, South Asia is expected or forecasted to achieve 7.8% economic growth, which is quite impressive. And when you look at Middle East, last year it was 1.3%, but in 2022 it's going to more than double to achieve 3.0%. And in North Africa, last year it was 4.8%, and that momentum is expected to continue also in 2022. 4.8% is a quite significant economic growth. So as you can see from these figures, major regions that compose the so wider Indo-Pacific region is expected to achieve very strong economic growth and maintain a positive economic trajectory. This is my first point. My second point with regard to this map is that the major economies of the United States, China, and Japan have all declared their intention to engage this region economically. For example, one of the major Chinese initiatives, as you all know, has been the One Belt, One Road initiative, or sometimes recently more noted as the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. China has declared its intention to invest in some of the infrastructure development projects in this region. And so there is this expectation that there will be a lot of financing and funds and resources available to many of the countries that aspire to achieve high economic growth. Also, Japan and the United States have also declared their intention to pursue the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which has several components, which I will elaborate later on, but also includes this economic component, which looks at advancing economic prosperity in the region. So, as you can see, the region economically is expected to achieve very strong economic growth. And at the same time, the major countries, major economic powers in the region have also declared their very positive, enthusiastic attention to sustain and support this economic growth in the region. So one of the questions that an international politics scholar asks is, what are the fundamental conditions that are necessary to keep the region on a sustainable economic growth path? And one of the very important conditions necessary to keep this positive momentum is what we call a rules-based order. Now, this region is endowed with economic vitality generated by various economies that I just mentioned earlier. But stable economic activity and transaction can be realized on the basis of a stable regional order underpinned by shared rules and norms. Shared rules and norms. Why are rules and norms important? Rules and norms are important because they serve a very important function. Rules and norms regulate the exercise of power by states. If rules and norms are shared, they generate pattern of behavior, because all countries are expected to behave in a certain way that is stipulated in various rules and norms. And as a result, you could expect a sort of a predictability, an expectation for rule-compliant behavior in the region. So if you have more rules and norms, then you generate predictability and stability in interstate relations. So the reason why we need a rules-based order is because it stabilizes interstate relations and it creates predictability. And these are very important properties of international relations that allow for sustained economic growth. If there is less rules and norms in international relations, since we do not have a world government, if we do not have rules and norms, it is likely that interstate relations are likely to be governed more by naked exercise of power or arbitrary exercise of power. And that kind of condition creates risks and uncertainty and mistrust even. And it is not conducive to positive economic growth. So, based on this kind of theoretical premise, well, actually not only theoretical but historical understanding, I think the prosperity of the region will depend on several or three important factors. This is my argument. Number one, free and open maritime order that will allow the free flow of lawful commerce. This is one of the very important features that is necessary to allow all the countries in the region to benefit from lawful commerce in the region. The second factor is enhanced connectivity, which is a rather abstract term. But in essence, this is about infrastructure, roads, bridges, and ports that connect countries, that allow for the large flow of lawful commerce. So if you have lots of ports, functional ports, bridges and roads that are able to carry and transport goods and manufactured goods, and even people throughout the Indo-Pacific region, you allow for much stronger economic growth. And thirdly, obviously, is peace and security that will provide for the stable flow of lawful commerce. So these are the three fundamental prerequisites or required conditions that are necessary to keep the Indo-Pacific region on a positive path. So having based on this kind of premise, the Japanese government, under the leadership of Prime Minister Abe, is now advancing this free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. This concept was originally rolled out in Prime Minister Abe's speech at the Indian Parliament back in 2007. This was during his first term in office. It was delivered as a concept regarding development assistance. He talked about essentially connecting Asia and Africa. And he argued how important the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific region is. This concept was given new energy or new vitality when Prime Minister Abe gave a speech at the Tokyo International Conference for African Development, or more commonly known as TCAD, in August 2016. It is now given a sort of a new context or sort of a reinvigorated content to advance these positive causes or to establish or nurture some of the very necessary conditions that is required to put the Indo-Pacific region on an economic growth path. There are, I think, two major goals for this strategy. First is to nurture an open maritime order based on the rule of law. And second is to foster and also bolster economic development in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, one of the important things to keep in mind when we talk about the free and open Indo-Pacific region is that it is an order building and economic development concept. Some people who work on the security side or the strategic studies side tend to view this as a sort of a counter-China strategy. But it is not. It is actually an inclusive framework. It is an inclusive strategy where Japan, and together with the United States, is inviting many countries around the world to actually share the cause and advance in nurturing some of the conditions that I mentioned earlier. So it is not directed at any particular country as a means of containment. So I just want to underline this point very clearly. The reason why it is not a counter-China strategy, it is because it is an order-building strategy. Ultimately, what it wants to do is to establish shared rules and norms, and thereby advance economic development in the region. So this is sort of a notional map of what the free and open Indo-Pacific region encompasses. And there are many small, I'm sorry about the small letters over there, but you don't have to look at all the individual projects there. But I want to underline three elements that are contained in this free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. The first element is the promotion and establishment of rule of law, freedom of navigation. This is about rule promotion. We want to advance interstate relations governed by international rules and norms. Second, the pursuit of economic prosperity. This is about improving connectivity that I was mentioning earlier. This is about investing in infrastructure around this region. And thirdly, commitment for peace and stability. There are many factors that are included in this third element. For example, capacity building for maritime law enforcement or maritime security. We want to provide ships and cutters to countries that require maritime law enforcement capabilities to enforce domestic law to their rightfully endowed maritime jurisdiction. And also HADR Corporation. This is Humanitarian Assistance Disaster Relief Corporation. As you know, Japan suffered from a major earthquake and tsunami back in 2011. And long before that, we have a long history of disaster relief. So we want to share the experience and training to third countries so that there will be more stability in the region. And there are other elements contained in this third leg. I wrote etc., but it includes counterterrorism, for example, counterterrorism capacity building. It also includes anti-piracy efforts also. So these are the three major elements that are now contained in the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, I also want to point out that this is still a developing concept, I think. It has been rolled out, it has been given new content. But I think in the years to come, my personal observation is that it is likely to encompass a much wider array of efforts to forge a stable rules-based order that would sustain strong economic growth. So, Japan, what it has been doing is not only declare this concept, but it is now actively pursuing cooperation with other countries, or major partners, if you will. For example, with the United States, Prime Minister Abe and President Trump, during their summit meeting in November last year, agreed to promote the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And as you know, the Trump administration now embraces this exact phrase, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And some of the development agency authorities have concluded memorandum of understanding to further cooperation for infrastructure development and other kind of development assistance efforts in third countries. One example, as you see, is Overseas Private Investment Corporation, or OPIC. This is a US arm for development aid. And OPIC and Japan Bank for International Cooperation and Nippon Export and Investment Insurance have concluded a memorandum of understanding for cooperation. Also, US Trade and Development Agency, or USTDA, and the Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, or METI, have both also concluded a memorandum of understanding to further their cooperation for economic development. And not only with the United States, Japan actually has decided to cooperate also with China. Prime Minister Abe and President Xi held their summit meeting last November and shared the view that Japanese and Chinese business in third countries will be beneficial to the development of relevant countries, and that Japan and China should discuss how they can contribute and cooperate in this regard. And I think at the end of last year, the Japanese government devised a guideline for Japanese businesses to show what kind of area Japan can cooperate with China. And they stipulated that cooperation in the areas of energy efficiency, industrialization, and connectivity, as well as development and management of solar energy, wind energy, high-efficiency gas and coal power generation. These are some of the potential areas where Japan sees possibility. But obviously, Japan will cooperate with China on projects where certain conditions are met, like openness, transparency, fiscal soundness, economic viability, and so forth. So Japan would like to engage China and also encourage China to fulfill some of these standards that are enshrined in global institutions. So the point that I was trying to make over here is that Japan is now trying to take the lead or take the initiative and get the United States and also China on board to forge joint projects and cooperative endeavors in the Indo-Pacific region. So this is the first part of my presentation. Very positive, optimistic tone, basically. Now I have to move to the second part, which I have to talk about security risks. Traditionally, the United States has been playing the primary role of coalition builder. And I think there has been a history of trying to nurture and develop a rules-based order. But in recent years, we are seeing some worrying trends that tend to work against nurturing a rules-based order. For example, when we look at the United States, I think the United States under Mr. Trump is becoming increasingly focused on a very narrow set of issues and rules. I hope the trend will change, and I think we do some positive and negative developments. But I think this notion of America first has tended to make the United States focused on a very particular set of issues. Secondly, countries like China, Russia, North Korea, and terrorist criminal organizations have been violating some fundamental norms, such as peaceful resolution of disputes, nuclear non-proliferation, and counterterrorism, and so forth. And some of the actions that they have taken have remained unaddressed and have not been pushed back or rolled back, to be quite honest. And as a result, I think in many capitals, there is this general feeling that power is prevailing over rules and norms. So, in my view, I think the Japanese government faces several strategic challenges that I mentioned earlier. First of all, is to kind of encourage and urge the United States to engage in a wider range of issues. We want the United States to be more attentive to issues other than North Korean trade, for example. And secondly, to induce China to abide by international rules and norms upon exercising its power. We do not want to demonize China or antagonize or confront China, but we would like to see China play a positive role. But I do think that we need to take certain measures and make diplomatic protests to induce China to take a more positive direction. And thirdly, obviously, is to compel North Korea to completely and irreversibly dismantle its nuclear weapons programs and missile programs and comply with United Nations Security Council resolutions. And there are obviously missile issues and abduction issue, which I will talk about later on. So this is the current state of the security risks, part of the security risks that the Indo-Pacific region is facing right now. So I would like to talk about the United States, China, and North Korea in that order. First of all, the United States. How has Japan been seeing and reacting to Mr. Trump? When we were listening to Mr. Trump during the election campaign in 2016, we were very, very worried because he apparently seemed disinterested in upholding some of the alliance commitments that United States has long held. And so one of the first steps of Prime Minister Abe was to engage Mr. Trump very early on, even before he assumed the White House's Oval Office. And through a series of summit meetings, I think the first one occurred quite early on, through a series of summit meetings, on the security side, I think we were able to secure or reaffirm all of the pre-existing security guarantees. I personally think it was A+ for the Japanese diplomatic authorities to secure all of the bilateral defense commitments from the United States. I think we basically got everything from these joint statements. And I think Prime Minister Abe and Mr. Trump was successful in building a very close personal relationship. I think last year, the leader around the world, one of the top leaders who had most conversations with Mr. Trump was Prime Minister Abe. 17 phone calls and 3 summit meetings. I think 20 times was their actual encounter. And I think this kind of shows the degree of the close relationship between Prime Minister Abe and Mr. Trump. And I think this has now become a sort of a strategic asset for Japan. However, I think there are questions that remain on the economic side. As you know, Mr. Trump pulled out the United States from the TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And he has talked about his desire to see some sort of a bilateral free trade agreement with Japan. This is something that Japan doesn't want to see happen. And we established this bilateral economic dialogue mechanism at the Vice Prime Minister and Vice President level between Mr. Aso and Mr. Pence. And I think we have had several of these economic dialogues, and so far we have been able to manage and work on some of very technical economic issues, but have avoided this very contentious or controversial trade deficit issue at the heads of state level. So this was a sort of the first initial handling, or our initial response to the United States or the Trump administration early on. And all the while, I think we have been trying to understand what this America First means in the real area of foreign policy. And this is my personal interpretation or observation. But I think the notion of America First has been translated into 2 fundamental policy goals. Number 1 is the very strong focus on homeland security and homeland defense. This has been there during previous administrations. Previous administrations have also focused on homeland security. But I think one of the conspicuous characteristics of the Trump administration is to focus on homeland security so much that they deprioritize some of the other issue areas. We can see this in counterterrorism effort. I think we all saw US effort to counter ISIS in Iraq and Syria. We also see this in the immigration policy of the Trump administration. And we also see counter-proliferation or counter-nuclear proliferation policy regarding North Korea and obviously Iran, which is very controversial. A second sort of reflection of the America First concept is Mr. Trump's sort of almost an obsession with reducing trade deficits. We have seen this in the form of renegotiating free trade agreement. We see this in the withdrawal from TPP, renegotiation of NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, and also the renegotiation of KORAS, or United States-South Korea Free Trade Agreement. These are areas where Mr. Trump is trying to pursue the redistribution of trade benefits. Essentially, he believes that trade benefits have adverse effects on US economy, which many economists argue, take issue with. But in any case, these are the two sort of reflections or translations of America First in US foreign policy. Now, how did this play out in Asia? In Asia, I think it came out as US almost exclusive focus on North Korea and trade. With regard to North Korea, we all know that the US ultimate goal is denuclearization of North Korea. In other words, compelling North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons program. And I think all the countries involved share this goal, basically. But I think one of the interesting characteristics of the current Trump administration is that they emphasize possible military action in the event that diplomacy fails. And there's a big controversy around the world and also within the United States about the advisability or the wisdom of this line of action. But nevertheless, Mr. Trump has reinvigorated US approach towards North Korea in a very controversial manner, but nevertheless, he's trying to push to enforce non-proliferation norms on North Korea. With regard to trade, as I have mentioned several times already, withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement was a big disappointment for us. We hope that the United States will come back, but this was a sort of a clear manifestation of the America First approach. As you know, free trade agreement is very unpopular in the United States. So not only the Republican candidate, Mr. Trump, but also the Democratic candidate, Ms. Hillary Clinton, was also against, or actually for, the renegotiation of TPP. Because there is this belief in the United States that free trade agreements deprive the United States of labor or employment. And this was actually one of the very, how should I say, raw forms of America First in US trade policy. And they started renegotiating the South Korea-US FTA, free trade agreement, in the middle of a North Korean crisis. This was also worrisome. So these were the ways in which the America First manifested itself in Asia. Now, I could maybe point out another point with regard to this issue by saying that during the Obama administration, they talked about the rebalance to Asia, or pivot to Asia, as strategic orientations from the other parts of the world, especially Middle East, to Asia. And this was, in reality, was a sort of an expansion of a US strategic horizon from Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia. But I spoke with one of my colleagues who works at the Thai University, and he used this very interesting phrase. Obama was rebalance to Asia, or pivot to Asia, but Trump is pivot in Asia, meaning that he is reorienting US focus from Southeast Asia back to Northeast Asia by focusing on North Korea. It is rare, it's actually, we can't really hear from Mr. Trump, we haven't really heard from Mr. Trump talk comprehensively about a Southeast Asia strategy or a region-wide strategy yet. And we were hoping that when Mr. Trump came to Asia in November 2017, he would sort of talk about how the Trump administration sees the Indo-Pacific region or the Western Pacific or Asia-Pacific region. But when we heard his speech, it was pretty much about fair and reciprocal trade, which is about bilateral trade. He was talking about the necessity of bilateral trade at a multilateral economic meeting. So we thought it was sort of disappointing in a way. And although he talked about infrastructure investment and rule of law, individual rights, freedom of navigation, and so forth, there was no really any discussion about regional order or Southeast Asia or China strategy. So many of my colleagues and security experts and many of my colleagues in Washington became sort of concerned or worried that the United States was going to sort of exclusively focus on North Korean trade and not care or deprioritize some of the other issue areas. So what does this mean when it comes to rules-based order? I think in the area of non-proliferation rules and trade rules and freedom of navigation, which is also a fundamental principle or fundamental international rule, in these three particular areas, I think the Trump administration is actually trying to enforce some of the norms and rules in this area. Very controversial manner, by the way. But what they are trying to do is to sort of assert these rules and enforce these rules. In the area of non-proliferation, North Korea, trade rules, when it comes to chorus renegotiations, or one of the efforts that the Trump administration is doing is to collaborate with Japan and EU to go to the WTO to press China on some of these economic issues. I think that is trade rule enforcement. That is actually the desirable, idealistic route. But in some of these rules, what the Trump administration is trying to do is to identify rule violation and demand the violator to redress these violations. So in some respect, there is this trade rule enforcement action. Now, when it comes to import tariffs, it's a different story. I'll talk about that later on. Freedom of navigation is also a very important rule and norm. The Trump administration decided to regularize what is being called the Freedom of Navigation Operation, which is a sort of a operation conducted by the US Navy to challenge maritime jurisdiction that are excessive over the United Nations law of the seas. So in these three areas, I think there are some US actions that are trying to advance or promote or enforce international rules and norms. But in other areas like maritime security and economic development, we haven't really seen sort of a US enthusiasm or US initiative in some of these somewhat deprioritized areas. So this is an area where I think Japan really needs to take the initiative. As you know, the US State Department is understaffed. They do not have enough officials to devise concrete policy initiatives. I think this is the time for countries like Japan, Australia, together with countries like India, to come up with concrete policy initiatives and then convince Washington to come on board. Traditionally, I think the role has been reversed. It used to be that the United States takes the initiative and other countries would get on board. But now I think we're beginning to see this role reversal in some of these issue areas, like maritime security and economic development. And I think the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy is one such example. It is a vehicle by the Japanese government in an effort to take a sort of a policy initiative in some of these areas where seemingly US interest has diminished. Now, a new development that happened towards the end of last year was the rolling out of the so-called National Security Strategy by the United States, December 18th, 2017. Now, you know, there's a big debate about whether this document reflects, whether or not this document reflects Mr. Trump's conceptions or views of the world. I personally think that this reflects the Washington mainstream thinking right now towards the world. But essentially, it takes a very sort of a competitive worldview. It labels China and Russia as revisionist powers that challenge the international rules-based order. And it makes the statement that Chinese dominance risks diminishing the sovereignty of many states in the Indo-Pacific region. And obviously, it also makes the point that North Korea's pursuit of these weapons poses a global threat, and so forth. But one of the emerging, I think, issues for Japan also, I talked about, you know, urging the United States to be more engaging in the region. But I think we have to coordinate the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific region. I think there is this possibility that the United States might take a different version, slightly different version or understanding of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. For example, if you take the geographical scope of the American version, it actually, the far side of the perimeter of the American version is actually India. They don't, but the Japanese version actually goes to East Africa. And I think there's much room for coordination in that regard, for example. And what are some of the actual components of a coordinated policy programs? I think there could be a much more coordination. I'm not saying that this is going to be any sort of limitation, no. I think there's a vast opportunity for Japan and the United States to further collaborate and coordinate on this free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Because Japan wants to keep it inclusive. It wants to maintain as a sort of an order-building framework. And I think we want to kind of bring the United States to think in that way as well. So far, between Japan and the United States, the three elements that I mentioned earlier, promotion and establishment of rule of law, etc., pursuit of economic prosperity, and commitment for peace and stability. These 3 points have been agreed by Prime Minister Abe and President Trump already. But I think we need to further sort of explicate and make concrete what we want to do in this region. Now, moving on to China, China's rise. I want to mention several security issues that are posed by China's rise. Now, first of all, is this major Chinese undertaking by the name of Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road Initiative. And I think Japan acknowledges this BRI as a potentially very positive driver of economic development of the Indo-Pacific region. And Prime Minister Abe has already stated that Japan is ready to cooperate on some of the joint projects if they are met with certain conditions, as I mentioned earlier, openness, transparency, fiscal soundness, economic viability, and so forth. But I think certain infrastructure financing and development projects have caused the borrowing states to submit economic concessions. And this is sort of a worrying aspect of Chinese economic expansion outside China. Some of you may have heard the case of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka borrowed money and asked China to help develop a major port in southern Sri Lanka called Hambantota. They were able to actually construct halfway or almost halfway a major port in Hambantota, which is actually deep enough to accommodate a military warship. After the Sri Lankans discovered that they could not actually repay China on a scheduled basis, China started negotiation and said, we want to borrow this port for 99 years. And in the end, Sri Lanka had to provide this economic concession. And so now China is able to use, or has leased this port for 99 years. Now, reports say that the Sri Lankan government was not actually willing or enthusiastic about this kind of deal. But it sort of illustrates the kind of economic statecraft that China is now advancing outside of China. So potentially, there are countries who might want to borrow money to develop their infrastructure. But once they find out that the terms of repayment is very strict and harsh, they might be forcibly or unwillingly provide economic concessions in return. So this is one of the reasons why countries like Japan and other countries like the United States are saying that projects should meet conditions, certain conditions, like openness, transparency, economic efficiency, and viability, and financial soundness. So right now, Japan's approach towards this BRI is, I think it's two-pronged. Number one is to engage BRI, to sort of step forward and cooperate with China and encourage China to make sound decisions about these kind of investments and financing. And two, together with the United States, is to provide alternative financing schemes. If countries decide and figure out that borrowing money from China is too problematic or too worrisome, we want to be ready to provide an alternative financing means so that that country can borrow money without compromising their economic sovereignty or autonomy. And so this is another line that I think Japan and the United States are together working on. This is a sort of a way to sort of sustain sovereignty in the international economic order, I think. So this is one aspect of the security challenge, the economic statecraft dimension of international politics unfolding in the Indo-Pacific region. Another major issue is South China Sea. Over the past year or so, this issue has sort of receded to the background, but I think it's very important, very significant. Those of you who are familiar with policy debates of East Asian security in Washington, you may recall that President Obama was trying to focus on this issue, but although he failed to actually stop China from making China take unilateral actions. But what has been happening in the South China Sea is that China has been unilaterally advancing land reclamations. And it violates some of the fundamental norms of the peaceful resolution of disputes. And it has generated mistrust and anxiety in the region. I apologize for the small map on the right-hand, bottom right-hand side, but there are at least 6 claimants in the South China Sea. There are 6 claimants in the South China Sea. They all have overlapping claims. Very complex dispute. But if you are to sort of abide by the fundamental norm of peaceful resolution of dispute, the way to go about is negotiation. Negotiation. You have to talk to other countries to come to a mutually agreeable outcome. However, what China did was they said, this part is mine, and therefore I am going to change the status quo as I like it. And so what they did was they promoted, or they advanced land reclamation and also militarized some of these artificial islands. And they generated insecurity among claimants and littoral states in the South China Sea. So in response to this kind of Chinese unilateral action, what Japan, as well as other countries like Australia and United States have been doing, and also India actually, and other countries are doing, is to provide capacity building to South China Sea littoral states. For example, Japan has provided cutters or ships to the Philippines Coast Guard, and also to Vietnam, countries like Vietnam, and provide also training as well, human training. Now, let me give you some examples of what China has been doing from a visual term. This is one of the reefs that existed, well, that now exists in the South China Sea, called Subi Reef. This is 2012, July. This is perfectly natural reef, coral reef that existed here. Now, 3 years later, in 2015, China started digging sand from the bottom of the ocean and covered it on top of these natural reefs, and also do a landfill for these kind of reefs. 6 months later, they covered the entire reef with sand and started constructing facilities and also provide the basis for runways. And as of last year, they completed a 3,000-meter runway capable of accommodating a major military aircraft. And they also have facilities and hangars to accommodate other sort of aircraft, military aircraft as well. And you'll probably see the runway on the left-hand side running over there. And there are other facilities that have been understood to serve certain military purposes. And there are also other islands that have seen a similar fate. Fiery Cross Reef is also another reef that has 3,000-meter airstrips. And also Woody Island is another island. And there are at least 10 others that have been changed from simple reefs into militarized outposts. Why is this important? Some strategic specialists argue that if this kind of militarization of artificial islands is advanced, China will be able to establish what some call the strategic triangle in the South China Sea. This is basically the idea that those islands would be capable of operating military aircraft and warships out of those bases, basically, and be able to establish military predominance in the area. And although the one on the right-hand side called Scarborough Shoal, it has not been militarized yet, but if that is complete, as you can see, that each of the three circles are the operating perimeter of Chinese advanced military aircraft called J-20. So as you can see, it covers the northern Philippines. And so any US forces operating in that area would be exposed. So the shadow of Chinese military presence will darken and affect interstate relations. Also, China will be able to operate Chinese Coast Guard out of those posts. They will be able to be serving as resupply points and replenishment points for maritime Coast Guard ships operating in the South China Sea. And even for maritime militias, to be honest. So this is what China has been doing. There's supposed to be a dispute, but China took unilateral action to establish this kind of situation. And this has caused a lot of concern, anxiety, among many of the Southeast Asian states due to this kind of action. Third point, East China Sea, concerning Japan. Chinese Coast Guard has established a pattern of intruding into Senkaku Islands territorial waters. Senkaku Islands is a series of 5 islands that have been lawfully incorporated into Japanese territory in 1895. Japan has held consistent administrative control over these islands, but China started making claims against these islands beginning in 1970s when they found out oil was around this area conveniently. And starting from 2008-2009 period, they have started operating some ships around these islands. And we have had some incidents in 2010 and 12, which I'll be happy to talk about during our Q&A. But since then, they have established a consistent pattern of incursion into territorial waters and the connecting waters of the Senkaku Islands. And more recently, they are now operating naval ships closer and closer to the Senkaku territory. And I think it was maybe 1 or 2 months ago, maybe 2 months ago, I think a Chinese submarine actually entered into the adjacent or connecting waters of the Senkaku Islands. Very coercive. Japan has territorial issues with Russia and South Korea, but we do not take action. We approach those countries through diplomacy. But China now has decided to take action, sometimes a very dangerous action against Japan. Another activity that China is conducting is operating Chinese military aircraft and sending them into Japan's air defense identification zones. Now, when this happens, every time F-15 Eagles go up from the Naha Air Base for emergency scramble to intercept Chinese military aircraft. As you can see, the number of scrambles back in 2008 was 31. In 2016, it skyrocketed to 851. Naha Air Base used to deal with this issue with 20 F-15s, but they doubled it in 2016 to make it 40. But still, the average intercept per aircraft is at 21.275. I'm not quite sure how long this increase is going to continue, but it's obviously becoming a strong pressure on the Japan Air Self-Defense Force. Also, China has been developing unilateral energy development, taking unilateral development of energy resources in the East China Sea, despite our call and urge for negotiations. And so having all these activities in East China Sea, we are trying to respond by taking certain defensive measures, by bolstering our Japan Self-Defense Force and trying to create a crisis management mechanism, the maritime air communication mechanism, and also try to urge China to negotiate on natural resource development in the East China Sea. But we have yet to see how China is going to respond, because so far we haven't reached a final agreement on some of these issues. Lastly, on North Korea, three major issues. I'll be very brief because I'm sure that many of you have read on some of the major developments regarding North Korea. Nuclear weapons, development of nuclear weapons, development of and export of missiles, and also abduction of Japan and third country nationals. Kidnapping, basically, people from other countries. Now, in response to these very, very problematic actions, the Japanese government has been, together with other countries, advancing United Nations Security Council resolutions, and also taking national effort sanctions on the sanction side. And we have been able to successfully forge an international coalition to apply pressure on North Korea. And the basic idea is to convince North Korea that developing nuclear weapons is not going to be in the interest of the future of North Korea. Also, on the defense policy side, we have been taking certain national defense efforts to bolster our defense, and we have been advancing defense cooperation with the United States, which is our primary security provider. And we are also trying to advance trilateral security cooperation with the South Koreans as well. Now, as you know, there has been new development from the beginning of this year. Mr. Kim Jong-un is now expressing his interest to talk with the South Koreans and also the Americans. Now, I think when it comes to the negotiation, there are two different issues, two kinds of issues, very difficult ones. One, obviously, is the roadmap to denuclearization. If North Korea is going to say they're going to give up nuclear weapons, they're going to want something in return. What is the North Korean demand going to be? Are they going to demand the withdrawal of US forces from South Korea? Is that going to be acceptable to South Korea? Is that going to be acceptable to the United States and Japan? This will be a very tough question, a negotiation, a political process to go through. And with regard to the current development with regard to North, South, as well as North Korea and US negotiations, I think we can think about two potential possibilities: optimistic possibility and pessimistic possibility. Optimistic possibility is that Mr. Kim Jong-un has actually reached a decision that nuclearization or arming himself with nuclear weapons is not going to help North Korea or himself, and that he's truly willing to concede on some of these issues. But I'm very, very skeptical about this optimistic possibility. I think the second pessimistic possibility is more realistic. The second pessimistic possibility is that Mr. Kim Jong-un can continue or prolong negotiation while at the same time develop nuclear weapons and missiles. By continuing to develop nuclear weapons and missiles while he is talking with the United States and South Korea, will increase his bargaining chip. And I think the more nuclear weapons you have, he'll probably likely think that he'll have a better leeway to get what he wants. And we have to see, though, the optimistic scenario or the possibility or the pessimistic possibility. We have to see how the talks and the negotiations start. But I think there will be a very difficult process or negotiation over how to actually denuclearize North Korea. That's one track. A second track, a very, very difficult issue, is the verification mechanism. Even if you make a deal with North Korea, how can you be sure that North Korea is fulfilling its promise, fulfilling its end of the bargain? In 1994, there was the agreed framework where North Korea agreed to give up nuclear weapons, and yet we discovered that they had an uranium enrichment program in 2002. In 2005, there was a joint statement by the six-party talk where the North Koreans agreed to give up its nuclear weapons, but it reopened nuclear tests and missile tests and blew it up. So there is a strong skepticism in Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul that we have to be sure that North Korea will be fulfilling its promise, even if they reach an agreement on the roadmap to denuclearization. But we do not know where North Korean nuclear weapon program is happening. And we do not have a full account of where the nuclear missiles are going to be located. And so this is going to be a very, very challenging issue when it comes to verification mechanism. Now, lastly, why are we so serious about North Korea's nuclearization? What are the risks of North Korea acquiring nuclear weapons? How is North Korean thinking and behavior going to change if they acquire nuclear weapons? This is one of these issues where my colleagues, scholars who work on security issues, think about all the time. One possibility, obviously, is that he will use nuclear weapons as a bargaining chip and stay on the negotiating course. This has been a sort of a pattern that we have seen in the past. But how is North Korea going to behave if their demands are not met by Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul? This is going to be the very, very risky situation, because if North Korea acquires a nuclear ICBM capable of striking continental United States, North Korea could make two miscalculations. Miscalculation number one is that North Korea can unilaterally believe by itself that it can deter the United States. Now, the United States is not going to be deterred by 10, 20, 40, 50 nuclear warheads. But North Korea might believe that they can deter US forces from intervening in North Korea or taking military action against North Korea, and sort of put a cap on US escalation when it comes to military conflict. This is one type of miscalculation. Second type of miscalculation is that North Korea might believe that Tokyo and Seoul might no longer believe that the United States will defend Japan and South Korea, because North Korea will be able to strike US territory with nuclear weapons. This is the so-called decoupling issue. North Korea might think that United States will not be ready to sacrifice Washington, D.C., or San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago for the defense of Seoul and Tokyo, or other cities in Northeast Asia. And so if North Korea believes that, they might believe that Tokyo and Seoul might become submissive to North Korean coercion. Now, this miscalculation, when it combines with the first miscalculation, that North Korea can deter the United States, this creates a very, very dangerous mindset, where North Korea might believe that it can deter decisive US military action and coerce Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo through conventional low-intensity military action or military provocation, and demand the lifting of sanctions and the acceptance of North Korean terms and demands in the negotiations. If they are cornered, if they are unsatisfied with what they see in the negotiations, they might choose that path. This is the major risk, I think. This kind of North Korean miscalculation is the biggest risk that could potentially come about from North Korea developing nuclear weapons. And if that miscalculation happens, North Korea might decide to take military action, low-intensity military action, which will escalate into a very risky war, potentially a second Korean War. And that is going to have a devastating economic consequence on Japan, South Korea, China, United States. And if you have those countries' economy affected gravely, it's going to affect the whole world. And it's going to undermine the positive economic trajectory of the Indo-Pacific region. Very, very serious risk. So that is why we need to pressure North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons and come to terms with the rest of the world that they can live without having those weapons. If we allow North Korea to keep those nuclear weapons, sometimes countries like China say, let's talk, let's negotiate. But even if you talk and negotiate, and if North Korea is able to allow to arm itself with nuclear weapons, the miscalculation risk is going to increase because North Korea will have more nuclear weapons. So that makes it all the more urgent and necessary for the international community to combat this North Korean nuclear weapon issue. So to wrap up, I'll end it here. I apologize for going for nearly 60 minutes. So this is my final slide. I just want to sort of reiterate that the security dynamics in the Western Pacific will affect the trajectory of the region. I focused on East Asia, but obviously there are security risks in South Asia, Middle East, and other regions. But I think one of the most problematic issues facing the future of this region is North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons and also China's unilateral actions. Because when China takes those unilateral actions, it intensifies security competition. And if you have an intensified security competition, cooperation becomes difficult. So we just hope that China will be induced or convinced that it is in their interest to abide by international rules and norms and pursue also rules-based order. And so Japan's central strategic task in the 21st century is to minimize these security risks and maximize economic opportunities in the Indo-Pacific region. So Japan will have to take the lead in fostering an international cooperation and rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region so as to maximize the economic opportunities. And Japan will need to exercise leadership in minimizing security risks related to North Korea and China. And Japan will have to continue encouraging the United States to pursue a region-wide engagement on a wide variety of issues. And I think we can say that Japan, because of its peace-loving nation history, is ready to cooperate with any country that shares the cause of building a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think it's now that the Japanese government is taking the effort to sort of forge a coalition of states to pursue this kind of Indo-Pacific regional order in the 21st century. So thank you very much for your attention. This is the end of my remark. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mori, for a very comprehensive and interesting presentation. And now I would like to invite our moderator, Dr. Hussein Amin, Professor and Director of the Kamal Adham Center for Television and Digital Journalism, to start our discussion, and our discussant, Dr. Muhammad Kamal. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Satoru, Mori. It's been a wonderful experience to know all of these details about the region in a very short time. So thank you again. You did a wonderful job educating us. I would like very much to introduce Professor Muhammad Kamal, I'm sorry. He's an old friend of mine. We worked together on so many occasions, I can't remember how many. Professor Kamal is a professor of the American University in Cairo. He teaches at the political science department. He is one of the figures when it comes to politics in the country. Dr. Kamal obtained his PhD in international relations from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and his MA from Carleton University from Canada, Ottawa, Canada, and he was visiting professor at the University of California and University of Chicago. He has several publications in Arabic and English, and he knows about his area about the Middle East, but also with particular focus on global affairs. There are certain, we need to finish by 8, Right. So, Dr. Kamal, I'm going to invite you over here to as a discussant. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll be brief. I'll take about 10 minutes. First, I would like to thank Dr. Hussein Amin for his kind introduction. I also like to thank Dean Fahmi for the invitation and thank our speaker also, Dr. Mori, for his very interesting and informative presentation. I have been actually in Japan about a month ago, and I was briefed for the first time on the Indo-Pacific strategy. And I actually asked the people who briefed me to send us scholars and officials to Egypt and to Middle East to tell us about this important strategy. And I'm glad actually this is the second time in probably 2 weeks that I hear a Japanese official scholar to talk about it. About 10 days ago or a week ago, Ambassador Kagawa gave a very interesting also speech at the Egyptian Council on Foreign Affairs on Japan's foreign policy in general, and an important component of that was the Indo-Pacific strategy. I'm not actually an expert on Japan or security issues in Japan, so I will focus my comments on 2 points. The first point is the general context, the background of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And the second point is related to the Middle East and Egypt. Supposedly or officially, the Middle East is part of this strategy. So how can we fit into this strategy and what's in it for us, all right? With regards to the first point, I would argue that the Indo-Pacific strategy is just the latest manifestation of changes in Japan's security policy in general. Japan's security policy had changed a lot over the past 10 years. For many years and since the end of the World War II, Japan focused on economic tools, soft power, reliance on the US as a strategic security partner. This have changed, and now we can see more interest in security issues, and the Indo-Pacific strategy is just one manifestation of that. There are other manifestations. One of them is actually the creation of a Ministry of Defense in Japan in 2007. Before that, there was no Ministry of Defense in Japan in the proper sense of the word. There is also the publication of the new National Defense Program Guidelines in 2010, 2013. Also the creation of a National Security Council in Japan, housed at the Prime Minister's office. I think that took place in 2013 in order to facilitate intergovernmental dialogue on security issues. Also in 2013, for the first time, there was the creation of a national security strategy. Japan also increased its military spending. Today, Japan is the 5th largest military spender in the world, with roughly about $42 billion spending every year. Another manifestation of the changes in security directions includes that Japan has signed several security agreements with other countries other than the US. Before, it was only the US, all right? So these are new important development in Japan's strategy. And the question is why these changes are taking place. And therefore, why Japan is introducing the Indo-Pacific strategy. I would argue that there are international factors and also domestic factors that can help us explain this change in policy. the international factors or the international environment relates mainly to the rise of China. Maybe Dr. Mori will not say that explicitly, but it's definitely the elephant in the room. China is of a great concern for Japan. And when we talk about Chinese rise, we are talking about the economic rise. China now is the second biggest economy in the world. Japan used to be the second biggest economy in the world. There is a lot of military Chinese spending, projection of power in Asia and beyond. Now, China has built a military base in Africa, in Djibouti. The conflict between China and Japan over the few islands or the rocks, and also China's policy in the South China Sea and the claims over that sea and so on. The other international factor, as Dr. Mori explained, is related to North Korea. North Korea is a real threat, present and danger threat for Japan because of its nuclear program and its missiles program. The third factor is related to the US or the structure of the international system at large. There is a flux in the structure of the system. This is very clear with the election of President Trump, who is looking inward, and he doesn't care that much about allies. So that's also a source of concern for Japan. So these international factor, regional and international challenges has forced Japan to take a much greater responsibility for its security and led Japan also to cooperate with other countries, not just with the US. With regards to the domestic explanation or the domestic factor, it is related to the rise of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And one has to credit him for all these changes. An important change was that related to the amendment of Article 9 in the Japanese constitution in 2015, which allowed for a collective self-defense, allowed Japan to use its self-defense in a collective way, meaning within coalitions, peacekeeping, and so on. Other initiatives, actually most of the initiatives I mentioned in the beginning, the creation of the National Security Council, the national strategy, security strategy, and so on, were actually formulated under Prime Minister Abe. Prime Minister Abe's view for Japan to increase its defense capabilities and security cooperation with the US and with other countries. I expect that to be the trend in the coming years. I think Prime Minister Abe could stay in power until 2021, right? And his coalition or his party is very strong, and the opposition is very weak. So this trend will continue in the future. Back to the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, as Dr. Mori elaborated, it has a lot of opportunities. All right, it has a lot of opportunities because the region of the Indo-Pacific contains half of the world population. It encompasses 3 of the largest economies of the world, 7 of the 8 fastest growing markets, and it is expected also in the coming years to produce about half of the total economic product of the world. There are a lot of opportunities there. It extends from Asia to Africa to the Middle East. There are now three major partners with Japan, which includes the US, India, and Australia. And it's very interesting, actually, that India has now its own strategy, its own initiative, what's known as Act East policy, which actually very similar to Japan's strategy, and therefore they see eye to eye on many issues related to the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. The US is very supportive, and as Dr. Mori mentioned, this actually Indo-Pacific is now the official policy of the US administration. They don't talk about pivot to Asia or whatnot, but it's the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific strategy. There are military maneuvers or war games between India, Japan, and the US. I think it's called Malabar. It takes place every year, so that is some sort of cooperation within these three countries. So I would conclude this part by saying that today actually we have two narratives in Asia, two grand strategies, two grand designs. One is led by China, the One Belt, One Road initiative, and the other is led by Japan, and now includes also India and to some extent Australia and the US. And these are considered also, or could be considered also, as two Marshall plans, because there are a lot of investments embedded in these two strategies. However, there are still a lot of questions that needs to be answered with regard to the Indo-Pacific strategy. And Dr. Mori actually said it's an evolving concept. I think this is the right description of that. You know, it's very difficult to call it a detailed strategy, right? Because there is still a lot of questions that needs to be answered. One of these questions that will eventually need to be tackled in the future: what will be the institutional framework that will include these countries? If there is going to be an institutional framework, what will be the financial arm, you know, of this initiative? China has already now established its own bank, the Asian Infrastructure Bank. Will there be an, you know, financial arm for this strategy, or Japan will only depend on JICA to implement the financial or the development part of that strategy? Another question is actually related to China. You know, I mean, still very complicated. I mean, we hear diplomatic words from Japanese officials and from Chinese officials. Japanese say Japan one day could be member of the One Belt, One Road, you know, strategy. Japanese are saying we are studying the possibility that China can be part of the Indo-Pacific strategy. It's still a question mark if there will be cooperation between these two initiatives, and what will be the position of Japan and China in the other strategy. I think one question also is related to Australia. You know, Australia is a major partner in that initiative, but Australia has a strong relationship with China and has tried to balance its relationship with China and with the US and Japan and so on. So I think there are still a lot of questions that needs to be answered. You need a lot of much more meat, you know, for that concept to develop it into a strategy. Another question also is related to the Middle East. I mean, the official publication of this strategy refer to the Middle East, but it's not clear which part of the Middle East. Does that include North Africa? Does that include Egypt? The only mention of Middle East countries that I heard in the context of this strategy was Oman, right? But no mention of major Middle East countries including Egypt. All right, so my second point is actually related to this strategy and us in the Middle East and Egypt, and why we should care about it. And I'm very supportive of this strategy, and I could answer this question, why we should care about this strategy, in the following point. The first point is that a large part of the trade of the Indo-Pacific region goes through the Suez Canal, meaning that the Suez Canal is a natural extension of the Indian and the Pacific Ocean, and what happens in these oceans affects actually the Middle East, affect Egypt, affect the Suez Canal. The other point is that Japan announced that there will be a lot of investments, mainly in the infrastructure area, roads, ports, and other. And I think this will be a good opportunity for countries like Egypt, to be part of this initiative, to benefit from investments in these projects. A third point is related to the issue of maritime security. It's a very important issue for us because of the Suez Canal, because of the Mediterranean, because of the Red Sea. And recently there have been some disagreements between us and some countries in the Mediterranean related to gas exploration and the interpretation of the international law and the international sea law and so on. So it's actually very important for Egypt to be part of any initiatives that focus on maritime security based on international law and the law of the sea. The fourth point is that the Indo-Pacific strategy actually could be a source of inspiration for us in Egypt to come up with our own initiative related to security and cooperation in the Mediterranean, especially Eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea. And it could be based actually on the same three pillars, maritime security based on international law and the other international agreements, and also economic cooperation should be part of any initiative, and security cooperation. So my conclusion, I would encourage actually the Egyptian government to endorse this initiative and to try to find a way to cooperate with Japan and other countries within this initiative. And thank you very much.
Is it working? Good. Thank you. Thank you for Dr. Muhammad Kamal for your excellent points that you have raised. Now I'm going to give Professor Satoru Mori the opportunity to respond to the points, and if we have time, we can open the floor for the Q&A.
Professor, I was maybe thinking that since everyone is here, maybe we might collect several questions and comments, and if I might get the last 5 minutes, I'll try to respond as much as possible. Would that be okay? Yeah, okay.
Okay, so this is a wonderful recommendation from our guest speaker. So if you would like to raise a question, time is now. So we will take a few questions, and then we'll give the opportunity to Professor Satoru Mori to respond to the questions, and this will conclude our session for the day. Any questions? اتفضل سيادتك، عرف نفسك الأول لو تسمع، لحظة واحدة. يجي لك ميكروفون دلوقتي حالا.
Farid Abdin, EUC. Excellent points covered by Dr. Kamal. I would just add, he covered everything. It's fantastic. Dialogue. President Trump is proving that direct talks is working, and I really recommend this to Japan. Have dialogue with the leaders, and you'd be surprised how the differences melt. It's just fantastic.
Thank you very much. Thank you. But maybe I raise a question. The question has to do with maybe how far this strategy has been going for, how deep, Japan is really pursuing this strategy for now. Because, there are so many concerns regarding if it's going to happen or not. But, the efforts of Japan really driving this strategy. And,
Indo-Pacific strategy.
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's, the floor is all yours, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Kamal, thank you very much for all your valuable comments. I think these were excellent comments to my presentation. And I would like to pick up just several, I think your point about why these changes in Japan's security policy. And I think if you look at sort of with a wider time span, going back to 2007 Ministry of Defense, and then to NDPG 2010-13 and NSC and NS National Security Strategy, I think you're correct to point out that the rise of China definitely played a part. But I think if I were to articulate a little bit more on the rise of China, the time sort of, if I were to break it down, I think it had to do more with the way China exercised power, rather than the power growth itself. Because before South China Sea and some of their problematic actions occurred, we used to call the Chinese diplomacy smiling diplomacy. They were engaging the region in a very sort of a beneficial manner. And, that actually increased Chinese influence in the region. But ever since they decided to take sort of unilateral actions in the South China Sea as well as East China Sea, I think the sense of alarm has increased in many capitals in East Asia. And so, Japan and also the United States was actually decreasing their defense budget over the past several decades or so. But even during this whole time, China was increasing at double digits their military expenditure. And so why is it that we were sort of lowering our guard and yet China was trying to increase their military expenditure? This caused a lot of questions. And then this sort of exercise of power, unilateral actions begin to occur. So I think those kind of worrying trends obviously alarmed many Japanese defense officials and foreign ministry officials. And I think when China decided to exercise economic sort of pressure on Japan during the 2010 fishing boat incident near the Senkaku Islands. By the way, there was this fishing boat incident in September 2010 where there were Chinese fishermen who came close to the Senkaku territorial waters. And the traditional, conventional way to deal with this issue was to kind of fend off and send them away. But this particular fishing boat rammed into Japan Coast Guard ship 2 times. So Japan had to arrest the captain and a member of the crew of the boat. And so once they started the indictment and the legal procedures, we sort of deported most of the crews, but we kept the skipper or the captain of the boat. And then China decided to stop rare earth export to Japan and started applying economic pressure. And this sort of increased, dramatically increased. There was no military action, but there was this very overt applying of economic pressure on Japan. And so I think this changed the mood or our perception of China, sort of applying naked power against the neighboring country. And ever since then, I think China has become a sort of a security challenger in many of Japan's security dialogue and discourse. And, despite the reduction of defense expenditure, China was increasing their military expenditure and so forth. So it had more to do with the way China exercised power and the way China increased their military capabilities while others were kind of reducing their military capabilities, which sort of led to a sort of a reinvigoration of the Japanese national defense efforts. Collective self-defense, I would like to make clear that Japan's collective self-defense, as Professor knows, is very limited. It's not a global scope, full spec exercise of collective self-defense. It's very limited. There are 3 fundamental conditions where Japan will probably be able to exercise in very limited circumstances. And, there are debates about this, but probably when, for example, countries like South Korea is directly attacked by North Korea, for example, or United States is directly attacked by North Korea and other countries, for example. These are cases where Japan, country that has very close relationship with Japan, is attacked, and that there are no other means to sort of, and that it has grave consequences for Japanese national security, and that Japan has no other means to sort of take defensive measures. Under those circumstances, Japan can exercise collective self-defense. So in that respect, our collective self-defense reinterpretation, it was realized through the reinterpretation of the Constitution, Article 9, back in 2015. Now they are beginning, I just wanted to add and share with you the fact that now they are beginning to talk about the revision of the Constitution. 2015 was reinterpretation. Now they're talking about revision of Article 9. But, maybe, yes. Yeah. But the revision of the Constitution is not about collective self-defense. This is about matching the letter of the Constitution with the reality of the Japan Self-Defense Force. Because right now in Article 9, there is no explicit stipulation about Japan's armed forces. It actually says Japan will give up its warfighting power in Article 9. But in fact, we have Japan Self-Defense Force. So the reality does not match the letter of the Constitution, because the Constitution was written even before Japan actually developed its Japan Self-Defense Force. So there are several versions of the revision, but one version actually talks about adding a section 3. We have 2 sections in Article 9, but adding a 3rd section that recognizes the reality of the existence of the Japan Self-Defense Force. So I just wanted to share this point because this might come up in global reports, and some countries might say, you know, Japan's going to militarize and Japan's going to suddenly change its military. No, that is not the case. Section 3 amendment is all about just simply giving a constitutional place for the Japan Self-Defense Force. Domestic political factor, I'll just be quick, is about, obviously, strong leadership of Prime Minister Abe. Japanese prime ministers have been, like other countries' leaders, focused very much on domestic politics. But I think Prime Minister Abe is a rare leader who is willing to expend his political capital on foreign policy and defense issues. And 2015 reinterpretation was one such example. And so under the leadership of Prime Minister Abe, I think the Japanese national security policy has evolved quite significantly. And this trend actually, by the way, was actually starting from the previous administration, Prime Minister Noda. But Prime Minister Abe kind of accelerated and implemented all these new initiatives. And to be honest, one last point about Japan's defense budget was that it was decreasing like this. And even though people talk about the increasing defense budget, it's only increased just a little bit like this. So when you say Japan's increasing defense budget, you might imagine something like this. But this is not the case. It was decreasing, and we've only increased very, very modestly. And quite frankly, I don't think that's even enough to kind of deal with the very severe security environment that Japan is now facing vis-a-vis North Korea and China. I think what will be the institutional framework and the financial arm, I think we'll have to see. Right now, it's very functional cooperation. I'm not quite sure whether there's an appetite for institutionalization, because institutionalization, United States doesn't like. Nobody wants a sort of an Asian NATO. So I think I'm likely to say, I think that it's more likely that we'll probably see more functional cooperation among the major countries. They call it the Quad, Japan, United States, Australia, and India. And I think it'll also remain at the senior official level, because if they go to the head of state level, it's going to be too alarming to China. They might interpret it as a sort of a counter-China coalition. And we don't want to see that happen. So I think there will be functional cooperation, policy coordination at the senior official level. That's my personal observation. I think, you know, relevance with Egypt is a very, very important issue. I think I was in London 3 weeks ago, and UK is also interested in sort of seeking an interface. And I think many countries are now interested in how to get sort of involved and get engaged in the strategy. So I hope that the diplomatic authorities will come up with solid proposals about how we can, you know, connect the different countries to this Indo-Pacific strategy framework. And lastly, doctor's question about how deep is it pursuing. I think it is...
In terms of time, too.
Sorry?
Time. You know,
yes?
You know, deep in terms of time. So are you really thinking that it's going to resort in some meaningful way What
Okay.
you already projected to us at the beginning
Yes.
of your wonderful lecture,
Yes.
or time is working against you.
I think you could say that there are limitations. I'm not going to deny the fact that there are certain constraints. But at the same time, I think this vehicle is exactly the means to sort of reverse that trend. Some of the components included in the framework are designed to sort of overcome some of these adverse effects. And so I think the Japanese government is quite serious, although it's an evolving strategy and it sort of encompasses existing initiatives. But I think we can expect countries to cooperate and come up with sort of a deeper, realistic, and solid policy initiatives in those three areas that I mentioned. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, my simple answer to your question would be, quite serious. And we're likely to see more solid policy initiatives in the years to come, I think. But I hope, as Professor Kamal said, I just hope that Prime Minister Abe will be there to actually kind of push forward, because you need stronger leadership, a person who owns this strategy. And I think this new geographical concept is something that I personally believe would probably be carried on, because the strategic horizon of various East Asian major powers is now expanding because of, to some extent, China's also presence. And we want to forge an international rules-based order, and that requires all of these major powers to encompass this major region where there is going to be the center of economic growth. Yeah, yeah, okay.
Okay, allow me to thank our guest speaker today, Professor Satoru Mori, and Professor of Political Science and Global Affairs, and also Professor of US Politics at Hosei University in Japan. And I would like also to thank Professor friend Dr. Muhammad Kamal for being with us. Actually, I have learned a lot myself, and this is going to be an experience we're going to share. And thank you for coming. You have done a wonderful work. And thank you again, and thank your guests for coming. Thank you all for coming, and I wish you good night.